Hello, I'm Marvin Kalb, and in just a moment, an hour of live, unedited, unrehearsed conversation with Gary Hart, a Democratic candidate for President of the United States. Stay with us for Candidates 88, coming right up.
This series is made possible by a grant from the New York Stock Exchange Foundation as a public educational service.
From the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. Candidates 88 with Marvin Kalb. This week, a conversation with Gary Hart.
Happy New Year and welcome to the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. I'm Marvin Kalb, director of the Joan Shorenstein-Barone Center on the Press, Politics, and Public Policy. It seems as if this presidential campaign has been going on for years, and it has. But it is finally 1988. The preliminaries are over. In 1 month, it's Iowa and New Hampshire. In 10 months, it's Election Day. But between now and then, any number of other surprises are possible, on a par with Gary Hart's re-entry into the presidential sweepstakes. We'll talk about that and much else with the former senator from Colorado. But first, a little bit about him. Gary Warren Hart is 51 years old. Occupation, author, lecturer, former senator, now presidential candidate. Hometown, Kittredge, Colorado. Family, married, 2 children. Education, a BA from Bethany Nazarene College, 1958. A graduate degree from the Yale Divinity School, 1961, and a law degree from the Yale Law School, 1964. Military service, lieutenant, junior grade, U.S. Naval Reserve, since 1981. Career, lawyer, U.S. Justice Department, 1964-65, special assistant to Secretary of the Interior Stuart Udall, 1965-67, national campaign director, McGovern for President, 1970-72, 2-term U.S. Senator from Colorado, 1974 to 1986, a presidential candidate in 1984, twice a presidential candidate this time around. Let us now welcome Gary Hart. Senator, you have, it's good to see you again, Mike.
My pleasure.
You have often been described as a political outsider, a loner, and since you re-enter the race this time, you seem to have taken a good deal of joy from the fact that you're a political underdog. Now, when you did re-enter, you said, I have the power of ideas and I can govern this country. I want to address those 2 themes, your ideas and your capacity to govern the country. And first, the ideas which fall into 3 categories: economic restructuring, which in Russian is perestroika, military reform, and strategic enlightened engagement, which I assume is a sophisticated way of saying how do we get along with the Russians a good bit better. Let us now assume you are president. I'd like you to apply your new ideas to some festering problems and some very major problems that you would have to face. Number 1, arms control. Would you go for a 50% cutback in strategic nuclear weapons if you could?
I think the next negotiating position of this government, and it would be my position as president, is to accept the Gorbachev challenge put forward in Iceland, which is a massive reduction in overall arsenals in both ICBMs, strategic systems, in testing, in space systems, and in, as we have seen, some progress in regional systems in Europe. And in effect, accept that agenda and go from there. What has held up that 50% reduction in overall strategic systems over the decade is the President's insistence on space testing or atmospheric testing of space systems. We don't need to do that. We can pursue those technologies without jeopardizing the possibility of genuine, real arms reduction. And I think the Iceland summit, as I said at the time, was an historic breakthrough, which the next president has to accept.
And you would then go ahead and try to get that 50% cutback in strategic weapons?
I would, and I would go beyond that, frankly. I think a comprehensive test ban must be part of this nation's national security agenda. I have advocated what I call a Manhattan Project, a joint venture with the Soviets for breakthroughs in verification technology, which has always held up our ability to reduce nuclear arms, and the possibility under Gorbachev exists that we can do that. And I've also advocated a freeze on the production of nuclear materials, plutonium and weapons-grade materials. And finally, I would add to that agenda a joint crisis monitoring capability to prevent accidental or miscalculated war.
On conventional forces in Europe, you have at least suggested over the last year or so that you might even increase the number of American forces in Western Europe if you had to. Under what circumstances would you increase?
No, what I have advocated, most specifically in a speech at Edinburgh University in '85, is application of the so-called military reform principles to NATO, to ourselves in Europe, as well as our NATO partners. That means two or three things. It means over a period of time, through agreement with our military allies, a restructuring of the relative burden. I think in the 21st century, the United States ought to be prepared to pick up more of the air and sea defense of Europe, and our continental allies, doing relatively well economically, ought to pick up more of the land defense. I think we have to shift our tactic and our doctrine away from forward defense, which is a Maginot Line mentality, to maneuver warfare, and I think we have to increase the number of our reserve divisions. That does not necessarily mean an increase of expenditure or manpower. It may mean restructuring our military forces on the land, as well as the continental forces of other nations, into smaller divisions and having more reserve divisions available, which can be put forward very quickly.
But not necessarily sent to Europe, but held back in reserve.
Held back. A restructuring of the divisions which are there, changing what is often called the teeth-to-tail ratio, increasing the number of combat units, combat forces, and reducing the number of support forces, and having the Europeans get more, prepare more ready reserve divisions themselves. The Dutch have already begun to do that.
Okay, let's shift to the Middle East. The PLO, would you as president extend American diplomatic recognition to the PLO?
No, I would not, certainly at the present time. That has to be a result of overall negotiations in the region. After visiting there and visiting with the heads of state of Jordan, of Israel, and of Egypt in 1986 for about 10 days, what I did come back believing was that we ought to pursue, so long as the Israeli government wants to, the idea of an international conference. And second, that we ought to have been much more active ourselves in pushing the peace process, including in economic development on the West Bank. King Hussein told me, as well as then Prime Minister Perez, that one of the things that's needed is to give the people on the West Bank a sense of greater economic opportunity to help them resist the temptation of terrorism.
The Arabs have said time and time again that for them the core problem in any kind of resolution in the Middle East is settling the Palestinian problem. Do you share that view, that that is the core problem?
It is a core. It is part of the core problem. It is not the core problem.
How would you define it?
Core problem is to get the Arab confrontation states to accept Israel's existence as a matter of law and fact and move forward from that. Once that is done, then I think you can address other collateral issues such as the Palestinian homeland and the rest.
Shift to South Korea. Would it be your view that there should be an increase or a decrease in the number of American forces now based in South Korea?
I don't think there should be any change one way or the other. Again, that's based upon 12 years of experience on the Senate Armed Services Committee, as well as a visit to Korea in late '86 on the way to Moscow. And as a result of that, my strong feeling is that reduced tensions on the peninsula, that is between South and North Korea, must be higher on our agenda than it has been. I spoke with Foreign Minister Shevardnadze in Moscow about whether the Soviets were prepared on that specific regional issue to use pressure on the North Koreans to relax their confrontation and their threat to the South Koreans. He was, I must say, somewhat taken aback by the question. I don't think he expected it, but he didn't rule out the possibility they could play a greater role there.
In the Philippines, there's a feeling of some considerable political instability on the part of Corazon Aquino's regime. If there were a military coup not an unlikely prospect in the Philippines, and an anti-communist military government took over in the Philippines, would you do business with it?
Well, I think we'd have no choice but to do business with it in the same way we do business with the Soviets and
No, I don't mean it in that way. I mean, would you engage in the same kind of almost allied cooperation with the Philippines?
No. I think we then have to, under my foreign policy, have an obligation that is both political, economic, and moral to pressure that government, if that type of government should emerge, into democratic reforms, open elections eventually as quickly as possible, free press, broad participation in the political process.
Wouldn't this be something that any president would really push for?
Well, we didn't so much under Reagan until Marcos.
No, I mean, but beyond Aquino. If you look beyond Aquino, can you imagine any American president not recognizing the military government that might take over and not at the same time saying that you people have to return to civilian rule?
No, I think that's true.
Okay. Now, on domestic issues, on the issue of tax...
if I may say so, I think the real question is how to prevent that from happening. Okay. And again, this administration, as in the Middle East and elsewhere, has been much too passive. I think we all have to reward their final realization that the Marcos regime had to go and some last-minute support for the Aquino revolution, if you will. But I think we're much too passive out there, and I think we are inviting some sort of upheaval if we don't have some new initiatives to give Ms. Aquino a chance to get that economy on its feet.
Let's shift to our own economy. On the issue of taxes, would you raise them?
I would raise revenues on the grounds that there's no other way we're going to get the deficits down and finance the investments in this economy that are needed.
What are the taxes that
Oil import fee, which would raise anywhere from 12 to 18 billions of dollars a year, at least for the next 3 to 5 years, not only as a revenue-raising measure and a fiscal measure, but primarily as a national security measure. This country is getting dangerously reliant on foreign oil once again. The major papers of this country reported within the last 3 or 4 weeks that projected into the 1990s, this country could well end up by the middle of the next decade as reliant on foreign oil as we were in the early 70s. That is folly. It is nothing but folly in a security sense, political sense, and an economic sense. Also luxury taxes, $2 to $4 billion of dollars. Also user fees, $2 to $4 billion of dollars, and a continuation of the third bracket on upper income individuals.
A number of the people who have been here sitting in this seat, other candidates, have said similar things. I mean, Gephardt, Jackson, and Simon certainly also favor the oil import tax. I was wondering, is there a particular quality that you would bring to raising revenues different from what they would be doing?
Well, I don't think they've all been as straightforward or candid about the necessity. Here I would applaud Governor Babbitt, who I think is going to be your guest. He deserves a great deal of credit, I believe, and I've said this on other occasions, for his courage in stating the truth. This is not only an issue among the Democrats, it's also an issue with the Republicans. None of the Republicans I'm aware of is willing to step into the plate and tell the American people the truth, and that is you can't have lower deficits and a better education system and a cleaner environment and housing for the homeless and all the things we all want without additional revenues. It's a simple fact.
Would the budget deficit and the trade deficit be the top economic priorities of a Hart administration?
Along with the third priority, which is investment. I said my campaign was based on 3 words: invest, reform, and engage. I would add a fourth, which is service. But the investment part is I hope, well thought out and well documented program or policy, not only for public dollars, but for private dollars, to rebuild the basic foundation of this nation's economy. Our manufacturing base, our energy production, our agricultural production, our education system first and foremost, including job training, and finally our research and laboratory base for new innovation.
Senator, I think that just about every candidate has said something awfully similar to that.
Well, I'm glad they're following my lead.
Well, perhaps they are, perhaps they came upon it themselves, but is there something new that you're projecting in the area of the economy? Because if there is, I'd like to hear it.
Well, I think there is in several regards. One is the comprehensiveness of it, and the second is the detail of it, not only in this booklet, but in speeches and articles. I've tried to spell out in specific detail a 144-page trade bill, 100 or 125-page infrastructure rebuilding bill, an education reform speech at Duke earlier this year that has 12 or 14 points. a bigger, broader view, I think, than traditionally politicians have had. We can either focus on the micro policies, or we can have broad-based, sweeping, comprehensive reform policies, and it's the latter that I've tried to feature.
Given everything that you've just said, and to put it all together, how long would it take, in your view, to bring down substantially the budget deficit?
Well, combining those three objectives, reducing the budget deficit or our fiscal problem, reducing our trade deficit, and getting this nation's economy in the position where it can compete in the world marketplace 5 to 10 years. But a whole set of new policies have to be adopted. Let me say one other thing that I think may be different about my candidacy. What I've tried to do also is not just have an education policy or a military policy. I've tried to relate them. And you will find a careful reading of my foreign policy lectures at Georgetown a couple of years ago, the military reform effort for 10 years, is that they work together. The economics are the same thing. I don't think we can separate domestic and international economics anymore.
On the issue of how you would treat the problems of America's blacks, in the '84 campaign, you won, in the primaries that you won, you got 3% of the black vote. That doesn't suggest that you're really relating to them terribly well. What could you do as president to reach out to the blacks in this country?
Keep in mind, my principal opposition or competition in '84 was Walter Mondale, who had been vice president, protege of Hubert Humphreys, and very well known in the black community in this country for 15 or 20 years, and Reverend Jackson, a leading, if not the leading, black leader in America. So that's very tough competition. I did not emerge or burst on the scene, I guess, until after the New Hampshire primary in February. And then, as you know, it was a real roller coaster. I tried my very best at that time to put forward what I think is virtually, I shouldn't say perfect, but close to perfect civil rights record, not only for the 12 years in the Senate, but a deep personal commitment to the cause of civil rights and equality in this country that led me to support John and Robert Kennedy and George McGovern and others. And I was pleased earlier this year when I was an active candidate to see the polls beginning to acknowledge that I was getting my own record and personality across to the minority communities, and a much broader base of support in both the black, Hispanic, and Asian communities in this country.
You still have Jesse Jackson as a very prominent candidate in the Democratic Party. Do you think that you would be able, with your ideas, to reach out beyond Jackson's appeal to the blacks? Well,
I think so, and I certainly hope so, and I intend to make an effort in this regard. Part of it is familiarity. Part of it is a sense of feeling comfortable with that individual, knowing who that person is, having a sense of identity. And I think through campaigning, through information and education, I intend to make a very strong appeal to the minority communities across this country.
I want to ask you about the possibility of recession in this country. In the November, leading economic indicators dropped 1.7%, which was the worst since the early 80s, when the United States, in fact, did go into a recession, a rather deep one. How would you apply your ideas to head off a recession?
Well, we've begun. Part of what must be done is what some of us have been advocating for some time. Argued a year or two ago, the unrealistically high value of the dollar was crushing American workers, making us uncompetitive, and that had to be part not only of a trade policy, but a fiscal policy as well. Happily, that's begun to happen. It may be happening too much. One of the parts of both my economic and trade policies is what has been called a new Bretton Woods conference, not only to bring the value of the dollar down against other foreign currencies, exchanges, but to negotiate the so-called window, if you will, or margin of exchanges that are tolerable. Not a fixed exchange rate, but a fluctuating one within a ceiling and a floor.
Has the dollar already dropped enough, in your view?
Oh, I think it has. It's got to stabilize. I don't think we can leave it to the so-called free markets to do that. That's why I think an international monetary conference must be part of that process. That would help. Investment in this nation's economy will help ward off inflation. We are a wasteful nation. We are a consumer nation. We must transform this country in the next decade from a consumer nation to a producing nation. That requires, instead of spending our money, investing our money, public dollars and private dollars.
Senator, in going over a number of your speeches on foreign policy and military reform, I think I have a pretty good idea on where you feel the United States has misused American military power. It is not clear to me where you feel American military power should be used. What is left to defend for the United States?
Well, a lot of things are left to defend.
So give me a ticket off.
Our existing post-World War II alliances and commitments, NATO principally, our commitment to the security of Japan and our allies in the Far East, Japan and the Philippines, a traditional...
South Korea?
South Korea, certainly. That would be part of the Western
Taiwan?
Alliance. Under the terms of the Shanghai Accord, certainly. A concern for security in the Western Hemisphere, which has been predates, I guess, or dates back to the Monroe Doctrine and has been
Nicaragua, for
pursued.
example, let me interrupt. If the Russians were to come through and deliver MiG fighters, missiles,
no.
Would you use American military power to wipe out that threat?
Well, let's prevent it from happening by telling the Nicaraguans.
But if it was there?
Certainly. I think we must tell the Nicaraguans we will not tolerate foreign military bases on their soil that jeopardize our security or those of our allies. But let me point out one thing I think I have done that perhaps other candidates have not done, and that is spell out conditions under which American military force should be used generally. That's in the third Georgetown lecture and in this policy book as well. There I set out 6 or 7 criteria, and part of those were incorporated in the '84 Democratic Platform, and curiously enough, adopted by Caspar Weinberger when he was Secretary of Defense. That includes a clear sense of what our objective is or our military mission. That includes an understanding about the command structure so the civilians don't try to supersede the military commanders once a decision has been made. It includes exhaustion of political and diplomatic means. It includes the inability of our allies to defend themselves. It most of all includes a clear understanding on the part of the American people as to the costs of the use of American military force, not only in dollar terms, but in the terms of young Americans' lives, and an open debate by those American people as to whether they want to support on any continuing basis American military presence in any part of the world.
Senator, I said at the beginning of the interview that I'd like to deal with 2 things, your ideas and then your capacity to govern, because that comes right out of your phrase. Now, you may feel, perhaps even with what some people sense as a touch of arrogance, that you can govern this nation better than anybody else. But before you have that opportunity, the American people have to vote you in, and so they have to feel comfortable with you and with your positions. Now, the polls are saying something very strange now. They are saying that Gary Hart is, among the Democrats, the most popular and the most unpopular candidate at the very same time. What does it say to you that the American people can have this view at the same time that you're at the top and at the bottom?
First of all, let me say I don't think you can run the presidency of the United States without, I wouldn't say arrogance, I would say audacity, a certain sense that you, among, if not above the others, are best prepared to govern. If you don't have that, you shouldn't run for president. I think the question is whether it's under control, whether it's realistic, whether you have had a chance to size yourself up against the competition. And I recall very vividly, as a much younger man, in 71 asking George McGovern why he was running, and then in 75 asking Jimmy Carter. They both said the same thing, because I'm as good as the others. And there is that touch of competitiveness. I think it's in your industry as well as many others. And so I would say audacity rather than arrogance. I think that the task of any candidate, perhaps particularly or uniquely me in this election, is to demonstrate qualities of character, of leadership, of courage, of independence, of integrity that are necessary not only to put forward ideas and policies, but to educate the American people and form consensus through their elected officials for those policies. And my job in this campaign, as I said in New Hampshire, to let the people decide, is to convince them that I can do that.
All right. Now, before we go any further, I want to sort of stop myself and ask you if there is anything that you yourself wish to volunteer to the American people on this occasion about the various womanizing charges that have been leveled against you this past year.
Only those that I've responded to fairly repeatedly in the past, including on national television. I have said that I was very sorry for the mistake that I made. I have said that there's no way that anyone can respond to rumors and gossip, particularly in public life. I have confessed my errors and sins, if you will, in a way that I don't think any national leader has done in a long time. I've apologized to my family and just about everyone else. And there comes a point beyond that people either accept or do not accept that.
Okay. Now, do you feel, given what happened last May, why do you feel that the American people should trust you to be their president?
Well, again, that's a judgment they have to make. I have tried very hard over the course of a 50-year lifetime to live as straightforwardly and honestly as I can. We have a marriage that's lasted almost 30 years. We've raised 2 great kids. I don't think you can do that and be a very bad person. And I think I've served this country honorably and well for 12 years as a United States Senator with that, and run for president and been under a microscope. I never said I was perfect. When I announced in the spring, I said I'll make mistakes. That's because I'm a human being. I think we've got to have realistic standards for our leadership. I don't want to be held to any lower standard than our best presidents, but I don't want to be held to any higher standard either.
You said recently, and I want to read this quote to you, "I'm as qualified to govern this country as anybody in this race or anybody who has governed this country in the past 200 years."
Did I say
Now,
that?
you said it. You said it. You said it on McNeil era, and I can get you the date.
Okay.
Now, I want you to know.
Okay. That
What
is,
I really want to
that
ask-
is arrogant, and I take it back.
Oh, all right. I will.
Mr. Lair at the time was pressing me very hard.
You know, it was through clenched teeth
apologize.
that you said it, but you said it. You've also said quite often, and you said a moment ago, that a principal goal of a president is to educate the American people and to lead them. And you've also said that you would like to spark youthful idealism in America as well. The question I have for you, Senator, is this. Can you lead the American people if, according to the polls, so many of them feel that you have lied to them and that you have conducted your personal life in a way that they don't like? So how
Well,
can
I'm
you
not
lead?
sure the poll. Well, I don't want to quarrel about polls. I don't know which ones you're talking about or how the questions were framed. The fact of the matter is, if so many of them believe that, I won't be elected president. That's when I said, let the people decide. The people are the best judge of this, not the press, not the pundits, not the experts, not the party leadership. Let the people decide this. If they don't want me as their president, I won't be their president.
Don't you feel that a candidate, somebody who's going to be elected president, you go before the American people, and you said before, has to be held up to a very high standard?
Yes.
Can one lie?
No, of course not. But on the other hand, one does have a right of privacy, and the American people don't have a right to know everything about our leaders' lives. That is an issue in this campaign, and I think the American people have to decide it. How far do you want to go? It's not just Gary Hart. It's the caliber and quality of our leadership. Do we want to set up another barrier to participation in public life for young people when we already have an awful lot of deterrence there already?
What is the barrier that would be set up there?
Well, I think an intrusion into people's personal lives that is unprecedented. Keep in mind, I've had an opportunity this summer to do a good deal of reading about accusations made against George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Andrew Jackson, just about everybody. Keep in mind also that if you decide your leadership by polls, Harry Truman would probably not have been president. Then a lot of people who at one time or another were fairly unpopular that ended up getting into the White House or staying in the White House because people got things in perspective and decided what they thought was important.
Help me through the one part of it that I've never quite understood. When you told the New York Times on May 3rd, follow me around, I don't care, I'm serious, if anybody wants to put a tail on me, go ahead, they'd be very bored. The Miami Herald was not bored that weekend. It's true, it was the May, it came out on May 3rd. Miami Herald story came out on May 3rd. You would talk to E.J. Dionne, I imagine 2 or 3 weeks before that. Judgment now. Why or how could you have put yourself in a position in the midst of a campaign that could have led to what, in fact, it did lead to?
I will just repeat what I've said before. It was a bad mistake. It was a damn fool mistake. I don't think it disqualifies me from governing this country. What I said to the press after weeks and weeks and weeks of trying to knock down how are you going to respond to rumors, questions, is just to say, follow me around in public. I wasn't doing anything in public that I was ashamed of or could be ashamed of. It didn't occur to me that people would start peeking in my windows and hiding in my bushes. We've never done that for 200 years in this country.
Let's move on. On November 11th of last year, you did a speech at Yale, which I considered absolutely remarkable because it dealt with the press and your views about the media and the way in which it covers the political process. And you spoke of a blurring of the distinction between the serious and the sensationalist press. And I would like to ask you, because we're interested in that here, give me examples of the serious press and the sensationalist press in the U.S.
Well, I think we all know what those are. It's the difference between...
No, you tell me.
Well, it's the difference between the National Enquirer and the New York Times. Where the distinction gets blurred is when a major network leads its lead story with a story from the National Enquirer. That, I think, is a little different from what we've usually had.
No, but the New York Times in the case that you're referring to also ran that story. It isn't that the New York Times did not run all of those stories, right?
I understand. But I think you, given your background and others that have been in political journalism for a long time, would be hard-pressed to deny that the standards of what is printed today are different from the standards of what were printed even 10 years ago or 5 years ago.
I agree. And
that's part of the blurring that I'm talking about.
Now, you've made the point time and time again in that speech and on other occasions as well that the press is much more interested in sex than it is in serious substantive issues. In effect, you were saying that sex sells and substance doesn't.
Well, I think, would you disagree with that?
No, but I have to. You go ahead. I want to, the question that I'm trying to get to.
No, well, let me put a caveat in here because it is being alleged I am running this campaign against the press. I have not said anything about the press. Well, I am answering your questions, so this is not Gary Hart attacking the press. What the Yale speech said, you'll recall, was that we are all to blame. To the degree we are not demanding and insisting on serious issues, the issues that govern our lives, it's not the press's fault, it's our fault. The consumers decide. We get the information we ask for. As I said at the time, somebody is buying the National Enquirer.
The American people are going to vote.
Precisely. So this isn't my attack, if you will, in the press. This is what I was trying to do was to say we are trivializing our leadership, which was the essence of the speech. And I tried to give ways in which that was happening. And I quoted as a thesis for that argument very eminent historian Barbara Tuchman, who made exactly that case. She said there's something wrong when we can all get more excited about a politician's personal life in a way that we never have before, and don't get excited when 250 young Americans are killed in Lebanon.
Senator, I think the issue there, and she was addressing this as well, had to do with judgment. And if a candidate gives the press the option of focusing on sex, then why should the American people give that candidate their trust and their vote?
Well, I don't think any candidate that I know of, including myself, gave that option. I certainly didn't intend to and didn't want to. You have to go to extraordinary lengths if you're hiding in bushes and peeking in windows and intercepting telephone calls to find out something about a person. Let me give you
Was the press intercepting calls?
They told me they had. But in any case, I don't want to get into a quarrel about that. I was also told they were trying to put listening devices on my walls. They deny that happened, but a reliable source told me that. See, that was another issue I was trying to bring up in that speech. If you say it is now permissible to print anything, you have also said it is now permissible to find out anything any way you can. Now, that's a privacy issue the American people ought to be worried about.
It is a privacy issue. There's no question about it. But don't you feel that since there is only one person who's going to have his finger or her finger on the button,
sure,
there's something very special about that one person?
Of course.
It isn't as though you can protect. Once that person goes into the ring and says, I want to be your president,
right,
you are also affirming that even he, at that point, or she should have the right to say this far and no further.
But that's what we've said for 200 years. Very eminent
200 years, we didn't have the kind of technology that we have today.
So if we can find it out, then we should find it out.
Well,
is that it?
Yes, supposing that is addressed.
Really? Well, goodbye to an awful lot of future leaders in this country. Because I know firsthand there are a lot of people that won't put up with that. Because then you legitimize.
Let me just ask you this.
Let me say, the historic standard, Marvin, for 200 years has been that a public person's private life was private until it affected their ability to govern. That was restated by very eminent historian or columnist George Will. in a recent edition in Newsweek. That we have had as a standard in this country for 200 years.
How
now you are saying
no, I'm not
because
saying
we
anything.
can intercept conversations, we can use lenses to look in people's windows.
I am not saying anything about intercepting conversations. I did address the issue of the technology.
Yes,
that's true.
Well, that's what technology means.
That's right. But the question again reverts to judgment calls by the candidates themselves.
I made a mistake. I have categorized it as a damn fool mistake. The question on the part of the American people is whether that mistake disqualifies me from leading the country. Only the American people can decide, and that's why I got back in this race.
Okay. Now, I want to ask you just that one
issue. It has,
issue.
by the way, not disqualified leaders in the past.
Okay. Granted. I just want to ask you if, in your mind, you are capable of separating judgment into two categories.
No.
There is judgment that has to do with my private life. There is judgment that might be addressed to nuclear weapons or the economy or something like that.
Mr. Kalb, I have talked more about my private life than probably any living American, more than Ronald Reagan or anybody else. I have said, and my wife has said, that we have been separated. We have gone into the details of that. We have talked about it.
And it's sort of enough is enough.
Well, for God's sake.
Okay. Right. Let me just ask you.
But the issue of judgment, if that's what you're after,
well, I
must
think
be
that
judged
it's not just
over,
what I'm after,
okay,
Senator.
it
a
must
lot
be
of people.
judged over a lifetime.
Sorry.
It must be judged over a lifetime.
Right.
Now, I was under a microscope in 1984 when I ran for president for 6 months. We had reporters asking why we put up to our neighbors, asking why we put fences around our backyard for our dogs, who paid for the fences, who came to our parties, were they loud parties, was there drinking. It's not as if I just parachuted down onto earth. I've been around in public life one way or another for more than 15 years.
One more question on that.
And judgment also has to do with whether you voted against the Reagan tax cuts in '81,
right.
whether you opposed the MX missile, whether you fought against Reaganomics, whether you fought against Contra aid. I have broken no laws. I have not lied to Congress. I have not deceived the public in this regard. And I have not shredded any papers, and no money changed hands, and we've got to get this thing in some kind of perspective.
Senator, let me just ask you the last question. The last question on this issue. Why is it, then, that there is so much attention devoted to Gary Hart on this issue, and really not much at all to any of the other candidates?
Well, I don't know. I think it's a combination of a lot of things. I have run against the tide. I'm overcome a lot of odds all the way through my political life. I worked for George McGovern, when I ran for the Senate, when I ran for re-election, when I ran for president, and I have, not particularly because I wanted to, kind of always been bucking the odds. I became a serious candidate in '84 against those odds. All of a sudden the question wasn't what are the ideas, but who is this guy? And then as the emerging front runner, that continuation of who is this guy in a way that is beyond, I think, our normal standard. And I can't necessarily account for it.
Senator, we are at that blessed moment in the program where I stop asking the questions and the audience begins.
I thought this was fun. Why don't
All
we go?
right. I know two people who are going to ask questions. I don't know what they're going to ask, and I don't know what anybody else is going to ask. There are microphones conveniently set up on this level and in the balcony. Please, when you ask a question, ask it and don't make a speech. And Senator, we'll get to more questions if your answers are on the brief side as well. Our first questioner is Catherine Dominguez, an economist and one of the newer members of the Kennedy School faculty. Professor Dominguez.
Senator Hart, as you probably well know, a number of Latin American countries have recently announced a moratorium on their interest payments on their debt to U.S. banks. You have been quoted as saying that good economic policy is good foreign policy. Given that, would you be in favor of intervening in the debt crisis? Or more specifically, do you think it would be politically feasible for the U.S. government to intervene on behalf of the debtor countries, given the potentially adverse effects such actions could have within the U.S.?
I don't think we have any choice. I said, again, referring to the Georgetown Foreign Policy Lectures in June of '86, that, first of all, international economics must become a primary foreign policy tool for the first time in our history. And second, using a specific instance of that, I talked about the third world debt, but particularly the $300 to $400 billion Latin American debt, Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, and the others. And I said that the United States government's policy must be, no longer be, acting as the primary collection agency for American private lenders or even international institutions. What I did advocate was a government-led effort by all the lenders, both private and public, national and international, to restructure those debts over time, considering debt equity swaps, which others have since begun to look at, write-down of interest rates, notification of banks that they're not going to get their money back on the terms that they hoped they would 5 or 10 years ago when those loans were made, and they were good loans, and at the same time requiring the debtor nations to undertake some regulatory, tax, land reforms to get their economies back on their feet. Now, that's not just to the altruistic and right foreign policy of helping new democracies stabilize. It's also in our economic interest. Our debt, our trade deficit with Latin America, as you well know, is bigger in gross terms and percentage terms than our trade deficit with Japan. And the reason isn't because of Latin American protectionism. The reason is because they can't afford to buy our products. So that debt is crushing American workers. It's in our interest from a security point of view, a political point of view, and an economic point of view to restructure those debts. We have no choice.
I'd like to go to the balcony question there, please.
A major concern that individuals engaged in basic medical research have is a continuance and a growth of federal funding for these projects. What policy and program would you establish in your administration to assure growth in these funds and a protection of these funds from across-the-board budget cuts and or the transfer of these funds to military uses?
First of all, I'm against across-the-board budget cuts. I think Graham-Rudman is a fraud, and it's very bad public policy, and that's why, together with Senator Moynihan and others, I led the fight against it, and I think we got 23 or 24 votes in the Senate. Again, it wasn't a popular thing to do, but it's bad policy. It's terrible policy for a lot of reasons that we don't have time to go into. When I talk about investment, I've tried to be very specific. Senator Childs of Florida and I, on the Budget Committee, put forward on behalf of our party in the Senate in 1986 an investment package. It's contained again in these documents, and I will elaborate on that in the coming days as to what
into a Bible.
As to what a well, I'm the only candidate for president who has put anything like this out, and I'm proud of it. It is the beef, and it is a blueprint for this country's future. But I think we also, every candidate for president ought to put forward a budget saying not only where the revenues will come from, where the cuts will come from, and also, if you believe as I do, that we have to invest more, where that investment will go. Where I have advocated investment is in education, American Defense Education Act, High Technology Morrill Act, in Job Training Partnership Act, and the ideas for investment in job training and job transition that I and others have put forward. And finally, in a research program in biotechnology, in medical research, in energy research, and environmental research that you can't guarantee against budget cuts, but certainly wouldn't be cut in any Hart administration under Graham-Rudman or any other way.
Okay. Question right here, please.
Yeah, if you were to become president, what would you do about the growing problems of poverty, specifically the increasing percentage of blacks and women living underneath the poverty line?
We have to continue to finance those elements of both the New Deal and the Great Society, often shorthanded as the safety net, which have been cut very badly, contrary to what Ronald Reagan says, under this administration for the past 7 years. Those are for the people who cannot help themselves. That turns out, unfortunately, to be a majority of people in what we call welfare. Dependent children, single household parents, usually women, and elderly people, all people who cannot hold jobs. Now, Senator Moynihan has put forward a proposal for welfare reform which is addressed to the remainder of those people, including some of the women who are single heads of household, some of which policy has been implemented by Governor Dukakis in this state, which transitions people from poverty and welfare and dependency into the job market. That requires a stable income base in terms of housing, nutrition, health, and the basic necessities of life in exchange for job training and job location. That seems to me the only policy of welfare reform that makes any mistake. A solid safety net under those who cannot look after themselves, increased housing for the homeless, which is the scandal in this country, and attacking the root cause of the worst thing Ronald Reagan has done to this country, and that's increasing children in poverty.
Question right here next, please.
In the wake of the Iran-Contra scandal, the people of this country are increasingly frustrated with the covert seizures of power which have been going on in the executive branch. The other candidates haven't really addressed this. What are you going to do to bring the CIA and the National Security Council back under the framework, constitutional framework of checks and balances?
It's a serious problem. The first thing that happened...
It has been addressed, by the way, that particular issue. But go ahead.
Let the other candidates...
No, they have addressed it. They have addressed it. No, I just wanted to correct you.
I understand. The first thing that happened to me when I went to the United States Senate 3 weeks after I got there in '75 was that I was appointed to what was called the Church Committee. That was a shorthand word, the chairman being former Senator, the late Senator Frank Church, for the Senate Select Committee to investigate the intelligence community. We did that for 2 years and issued a comprehensive 5-volume report for reforms in the intelligence community, CIA, Defense Intelligence, National Security Agency, and all the others, including the Drug Enforcement Agency, that were partly implemented, including the creation of an oversight capability in the Congress that meant something. The problem is, when Ronald Reagan came back into office, that era of reform was reversed. Under the late Director Bill Casey, given the kind of policies this administration pursued, we went back into the bad old business of covert operations, destabilization, and I wouldn't be surprised if 5 or 10 years from now in another investigation, we will find out that there may have been assassination attempts carried out under this administration, as we found out in the late 50s and early 60s. All I can tell you, and then I served for a couple of years on that first oversight committee, all I can tell you as president, I would appoint a director of the CIA and a director of the entire intelligence community that would insist that no covert operation go forward without a piece of paper with my signature on it as president, and not one of those pieces of paper would be shredded. And if I authorized any covert operation, and that operation was approved by the Congress as is required by law in a timely manner, and it went sour or it went wrong, I would accept responsibility for it. Now that is the best guarantee you can have against rogue elephant operations in the intelligence community.
Senator, our next question is right here, please.
Senator Hart, the last 2 administrations have made major strides towards deregulating our energy industries. For example, wellhead gas prices have been decontrolled, natural gas pipelines are being converted to common carriers, and in the electric utility business, entrepreneurs are allowed to generate electricity on a deregulated basis. Well, in your administration, what would you do to further these trends?
Well, I would further many of them. I have been, as a, quote, liberal Democrat, in favor of taking off price controls on energy, particularly newly discovered energy. That was not, again, a popular position in the 1970s, but it was a national security issue for me. Where I would regulate energy, as I've indicated, is to impose a $10 a barrel tariff on imported oil. Now, that is an interference in the marketplace, and the justification for that philosophically is this. Markets cannot guarantee the national security. As markets cannot guarantee a hot lunch for a poor child, markets cannot guarantee this country will be sufficiently independent of foreign oil that we don't have to go to war for it and lose young American lives unnecessarily. That's how I justify that interference in the marketplace. But I would go back to the energy independence policies of the 1970s that included not only specific deregulation of new supplies of oil, but also incentives for development of alternative renewable supplies and incentives, most of all, for conservation. The Reagan free market approach to energy is not working, and that's why we've got ships in the Persian Gulf today.
Next question in the balcony, please.
Hi. Mr. Senator, in 1986, you went to Jordan and spoke to King Hussein, and then you spoke to the Prime Minister of Israel. But you did not speak to the Palestinian people who are under occupation, so you don't know how painful it is to be under occupation. Now my question is this: do you believe in a secular Palestinian state in which the people can live with peace and they don't have to throw any stone to the Israelis? And if that is the case, then I believe that you don't believe in our U.S. Constitution of secularism.
Just the question. Thank you very much.
What I have said and will continue to say is that until Israel's security and survival is guaranteed by not only the Palestinians but the surrounding states, there probably will be no resolution of the Palestinian homeland or statehood issue. When the Arab nations, or when the confrontation nations, or when the bordering nations are willing to make that basic guarantee and accept Israel's existence, then I think that opens the way for some resolution and frankly brings some pressure to bear on the Israelis to seriously negotiate that resolution. What we should not do as Americans is impose our own judgment or will on those negotiating partners. What we ought to be doing is to bring them together every way we can, and the way I tried to do after that visit, and after visiting with King Hussein, and after visiting with President Mubarak, was to put forward a step, an economic step to the West Bank that would have given greater hope and opportunity to the unemployed Palestinian youth.
In the balcony, please, the next question.
Senator Hart, you've talked about economic restructuring, yet the first item you mentioned in terms of balancing the budget is nothing short of trade protection. It's the oil import fee, which is trade protection for the big oil companies. You've justified it on national security grounds, which is arguable, but what isn't arguable is that by having trade protection for the oil industry, you may start a new series of trade wars that would be damaging economically.
Let me ask you this. If this is trade protection for the big oil companies, why are they opposed to this fee?
Because some of them support it and some of them oppose it.
No, all of them oppose it that I know of because they are net importers of oil. They are making more money off oil coming into this country that they're bringing in from the Persian Gulf than they are for drilling for oil in this country. And that's why the oil industry has always been against this. And even the independents were against it until the last year or two. Let me tell you, the oil industry in this country is powerful. If they wanted this, they could turn up more than 15 votes in the United States Senate, which is all we got the last time.
The next question is right here, please.
In the survey of international issues that opened this program, I noticed the omission of South Africa as an international issue. And it is my hope that in your new administration and your new ideas, approach to things, that you'll come up with some new ideas for South Africa. Could you elaborate on some of those new ideas and also put them into a broader human rights perspective?
I wish I had some new approaches in South Africa. They're certainly, my ideas are, like many other people's, are new in the sense they're different from the Reagan administration's. I was among the leadership that advocated and fought for sanctions that were imposed over the resistance of this president and this administration, finally and happily and thankfully. Do they go far enough? Probably not. But I think we as Americans ought to take some leadership from what is an increasingly frustrated, if you will, peaceful and moderate leadership in South Africa, Bishop Tutu particularly, as to how we should go. There was, as you know, a debate in this country that sanctions were going to hurt the very people they were designed to help. In my judgment, I don't know the answer to that, but if leadership like Bishop Tutu says we need this, we are willing to pay the price for it as the people who will suffer for it, then we must do it. I think an overall, the one thing that further that we can do and should do is organize our democratic allies to themselves bring greater pressure to bear on the South African apartheid government. We have not done that under Reagan. I would try to. Do I have some brilliant new insight in the area? I'm afraid I don't.
Next question right here, please.
Senator, I noticed that the fourth point of the Gary Hart plan is a very interesting word, service. And you haven't had a chance to elaborate on that. And I've heard that the Gary Hart campaign is pretty much the only forum I've heard the term national service come out. So I'd just like to give you an opportunity to tell me what that is.
Thank you. Briefly. I have advocated the creation of a voluntary national service. There are people involved in my campaign that have undertaken to create that on a local basis here in the Boston area, and I applaud them and reward them. And I think part of the reason they're supporting my candidacy is because of the sense that this campaign hopes to bring, particularly to young people, but not necessarily just one age group, that we owe something to this country. I don't think the country is prepared for a mandatory national service, but I think to give young people an opportunity to give something back to their country, for the same reasons that I got into politics under John Kennedy, is something very important. I think we ought to have a literacy corps. I think young people getting guaranteed student loans should be required, if you will, in exchange for that, to give a few hours a week to help educate, teach a young person or an adult how to read. The list goes on of things that people who receive something from the government ought to be prepared to give back to our country.
Senator, our final questioner is Professor Joseph Nye, an expert on arms control and director of our Center for Science and International Affairs.
Senator, you have spoken a number of times against the spread of nuclear weapons. There are now 7 or 8 countries that have nuclear weapons, but you have spoken mostly in generalities. I wonder what new ideas specifically you have about the spread of nuclear weapons to countries like Israel, South Africa, Pakistan.
The one specific that I did mention in a rapid run-through of my arms control policy was a freeze on the production, an international freeze on the production of plutonium and weapons-grade material. very hard to enforce. I understand the difficulties of that, as you and others experts in the area know. But we ought to begin to try to take the lead. Now, we have strengthened to a degree the international inspection capability of the International Atomic Inspection Agency. We can use that, I think, as a format to challenge other nations to join us in strict inspection of the weapons-grade material that's being produced. We also ought to be exercising more political and diplomatic leadership in getting international non-proliferation agreements. Very hard for us to do when we are encouraging other nations to develop a nuclear capability that can be made into a weapons or military capability. And that's why I have joined Senator Glenn and others in being very critical of this nation's policy with regard to Pakistan and other nations and proliferation. But I think it's one of the most serious problems we face. The 140 tons as of 4 or 5 years ago of plutonium in the world, that's an awful lot of material to make weapons with, and we've got to stop producing it, freeze that production, and we can take the lead.
How will you apply that to Israel and South Africa?
Well, it's a problem, as you know, of once the horse is out of the barn, it's a little late to close the barn door. Here I think we have to insist to the degree we can, given the realities of national sovereignty, on international inspection of power plants as to whether they are in fact being used to reprocess, and putting the international spotlight on nations that refuse to disclose what their nuclear capability is. Further than that, there's not a military solution that I know of.
Senator, in about 15 seconds, which do you enjoy writing more, fiction or nonfiction?
Depends on the circumstances. No, I've enjoyed writing the novels, and I hope to do that again as president or beyond that.
Okay. Thank you very, very much for being our guest today. Appreciate that. Thank you all, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you all, ladies and gentlemen, for being such a good and enthusiastic audience. Next week, we will have another candidate, the former governor of Arizona, Bruce Babbitt, a Democratic candidate for President of the United States. And now, on behalf of the Joan Shorenstein Barone Center on the Press, Politics, and Public Policy, here at the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University, I'm Marvin Kalb, and we'll see you next week with Candidates 88. Thank you.